Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 8, explain the relationship between slavery, growing North-South divisions, and westward expansion that led to the outbreak of the Civil War. In particular, we're looking at Part B of that standard, examine James K. Polk's presidency in the fulfillment of Manifest Destiny, including the annexation of Texas and Oregon. James K. Polk became the 11th president of the United States after winning a close election in 1844. Once in office, Polk added to the nation's western lands by annexing Texas and part of Oregon. Annexing, like seizing, taking control of, fancy word for it. Many Americans believed it was the destiny of the United States to expand across the continent. Others worried that the United States' efforts to acquire more lands would lead to war. James K. Polk's actions led to both during his presidency. He added territory to the U.S. and fought a war with Mexico over expansion. Americans have always looked westward. As the coastal plains filled, arriving colonists from Europe sought the unclaimed lands of the backcountry of each colony. After the American Revolution, settlers began to fill the Ohio Valley and move into western Georgia and Alabama. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of America and gave new opportunities for settlers to move into the Mississippi River Valley. Florida, the last piece of foreign-held territory in the East, was acquired from Spain in 1819. By 1850, Americans had settled California, Oregon, and Washington on the Pacific coast. The process of settlement to reach the Appalachians took 150 years, then another 50 years to reach the Mississippi River, and then another 30 years to settle the Pacific states. In 230 years, Americans had dominated the continent. Americans believed that such rapid expansion must have been a result of divine favor, referred to as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a phrase coined to describe the American belief that it was America's destiny to expand and settle the entire continent of North America. The phrase originated in 1845 when a newspaper editor, John L. O'Sullivan, wrote, "It was America's manifest destiny to expand and settle the entire North American continent due to providence for the free development of the yearly multiplying millions." The center of the population growth in the years following the War of 1812 was in the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and northern Kentucky. In this region, there were three factors that encouraged families to move to the Midwest. First, American Indians were removed from the region. Second, land speculators had these large tracts of land and they were eager to sell them. Third, as the national infrastructure expanded across the U.S., it became easier to migrate to the West. Although interest rates were high on land, so were grain prices throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Fertile soil and the development of better plows and harvesters allowed farmers to produce large crop yields, which also increased the allure, the attraction of westward expansion. Westward expansion was a pivotal issue in the 1844 presidential election. Texas was not a state at the time and was a region heavily entrenched in slavery. Many Northerners were opposed to the Texas annexation due to the slavery issue and its political implications. So Northerners thought, oh, if Texas has slavery, then they're going to support slavery, and now it will tip the scales in slave states' favor. The Democratic Party struggled with the issue and were unsure on which candidate to nominate to put up for the election. Former President Martin Van Buren of New York was opposed to annexation. The Southern members of the Democratic Party supported John C. Calhoun of South Carolina for the nomination. Calhoun was in favor of slavery and the immediate annexation of Texas. The nominating convention was at a roadblock on which Democratic candidate to support until the party finally nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee. He was a true expansionist who believed in manifest destiny and wanted to annex Texas and take claim to Oregon and California. His campaign slogan, 5440 or fight, was a reference to the latitudinal boundary line between Oregon Territory and Russian-held Alaska, meaning he's willing to fight for that Oregon Territory. Polk's opponent in the election was the famous Whig candidate Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay's position on the annexation of Texas was uncertain because Clay focused more on his American system agenda and the internal improvements with that rather than weigh in on the expansion issue. As a result, the New York wing of the Whig Party abandoned Clay and instead supported the anti-slavery Liberty Party in the election. The 36 New York Electoral College votes proved decisive in James K. Polk's 170 to 105 victory in the election. The Democratic victory in 1844 was thought to be a signal from the public that annexing Texas was the desire of the people. Texas was annexed, and when Polk took office, it was his job to deal with Mexico's reaction to the American claim on land that Mexico viewed as their own. Polk also faced a decision to make on how to fulfill that campaign promise of acquiring the Oregon Territory that was also claimed by Great Britain. Since 1818, the Oregon Territory was essentially shared between the Great Britain and the United States in a treaty signed where they agreed to joint occupation of the territory. It was likely that Polk would have to fight Mexico to resolve the southern border of Texas issue and have to fight Great Britain in securing claim to the Oregon Territory. Fighting Great Britain for a third time was the least appealing option. Mexico had recently won its independence from Spain in 1821 after hundreds of years of occupation. Given Mexico's new status and uncertain leadership, Britain would be the less desirable opponent in a war over expansion. Polk ultimately negotiated with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory to avoid armed conflict. Instead of acquiring the entire Oregon Territory to the 5440 line that was in his campaign slogan, a compromise was reached. The Oregon Territory would be divided and Great Britain would remain in possession of the northern section while the U.S. would annex, so take control of the southern portion of Oregon. The Senate ratified the Oregon Treaty in 1846, the same year that the U.S. went to war with Mexico over Texas. Polk had fulfilled the manifest destiny of the U.S. to span the entire continent from East Coast to West Coast, from Atlantic Coast to Pacific Coast, with the addition of the Oregon Territory.